most people are familiar with the general history of the development of mandatory K to 12 schooling. Elementary schooling was just being implemented in around the latter half of the 19th century. Secondary schooling, of course, was a response, a post-World War II response. Schooling's a bit different than healthcare and probably housing as well, in the sense that there was an interest on the part of the ruling class to establish universal mandatory schooling to create literate workers. And so the formation of school systems was not necessarily, didn't arise in the same manner, for example, as universal healthcare did in Canada. Nevertheless, the post-1970 neoliberal privatization is pretty similar across all three areas, and I don't think probably everyone in the room is pretty familiar with the commodification of education, the introduction of public funding for private schools, the implementation of quote-unquote choice models of schooling that are actually about creating private consumerist models of education. You see that here in terms of not having catchment areas, programs like sports academies, public funding of private schools, but in the US you see it in the form of charter schools mostly. And again, the US provides an interesting model because in some ways things are worse there as well. So people might be familiar that New Orleans now has no public schools anymore. They're completely charterified. Detroit is an interesting example of the impact of the financial collapse of 2008 and what the collapse of the city resulted in. They actually have kindergarten classes upwards of 40 students and secondary classes upwards of 60. So in our strike, of course, class size was the big issue, and we have 22 in kindergarten and around 30, sometimes up to 32, 33 in secondary. But there's certainly places where the rollback has been significantly worse. We have a serious crisis of solidarity within the labor movement. And so this, is going to connect. And it's actually interesting, we've got healthcare on this agenda. I mean, anyone who lives in BC who's involved in the trade union movement probably knows that we have, the nurses union that left the quote-unquote House of Labor, that we've had basically not since 2004, I think, which is now 10 years ago, have we had cross-union mobilization. We have, just like many other places, difficulties with respect to private and public sector union solidarity. But even within the public sector, which is kind of the last bastion of trade unionism and resistance on a large scale in North America, we have a government who gets it, right? They instituted the net zero mandate, for example, but we have a trade union response that, we can't even act in unison, never mind, have solidarity strikes or other kind of actions that are what it would take to actually push back on the agenda that we're looking at. We have a second problem, which I think is dependence on the NDP and seeing an electoral solution where the NDP, like other social democratic parties in the last 20 or 30 years, you know, to be frank, doesn't even actively support the issues that you brought forward, right? Does not support fully funded quality education. They have never in 12 years said we should have our class size language back, as just one example. And so I think the place we need to look is actually a rejuvenation of our organizations, because these are our places of resistance, into something that looks more like social movement unionism. You know, it's not rocket science, I guess. We know what needs to be done. The question is convincing other people and getting around to doing it. But actually, I think the moment is kind of right to start that conversation and to see where we can get. And if we can do that within one area, we can also look to how that could play out within healthcare unions, within other public sector unions, and then more broadly within the labor movement. Because what's really clear is that, you know, it may be that in 1965 you could go on strike for 5 weeks and make huge gains. In fact, interestingly, teachers won their pensions, I believe the year was 1957, with a one-day strike. But we're not in that world anymore, right? We are very, very far from that world. And what the level of militancy that could win gains or push back concessions in that post-war period is not one we're ever going to see again. And so the kind of organizing that we need to do has got to be drastically different. And I'll leave it there.